If you've spent your entire life feeling like you don't fit in, like the world speaks a language you never learned, what if I told you this isn't a flaw? It's a sign you're awake. Carl Jung believed that those who feel alienated are often the ones undergoing the deepest psychological transformation. In the next 30 minutes, I'm going to show you 6 secrets that outcasts use not just to survive cultural decay, but to transform their exile into evolutionary advantage. If you've always been the one who sees what others ignore, this message is for you. The exiled self. Why outsiders see the truth beneath the surface. There is a particular kind of loneliness that cannot be spoken about at dinner parties or office meetings. A loneliness that settles into the bones of those who have spent their entire lives feeling like strangers in their own world. You might have experienced it at a crowded gathering where everyone else seemed to speak a language you never quite learned. Or perhaps you felt it in the silence after trying to explain your thoughts to someone who simply could not understand the depth of what you were saying. This is the silent pain of not belonging in a world that has built its entire architecture around conformity and superficial acceptance. And if you have ever felt this way, you are not broken. You are not defective. You are simply seeing something that most people have trained themselves to ignore. The paradox of modern alienation is that feeling out of place can signal an awakening rather than a flaw. And this is precisely what Carl Jung meant when he spoke about individuation and the fool's journey beyond the herd. The person who feels alienated is often the person who has begun to wake up from the collective dream, the one who sees the cracks in the stage where society pretends all is well. Nietzsche once posed a question that still haunts us today. He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow. But what if modern life actively erases your why? What if the culture around you is designed to keep you distracted, entertained, numbed, and perpetually busy, so that you never have the space or silence to ask the deeper questions about who you are and what you truly value? The shadow's origin begins here, in this tension between rejection and inner certainty, because the outcast births creative potential precisely by holding this unbearable tension without collapsing into either conformity or despair. Society subtly rewards adaptation, and it does so with such effectiveness that most people never realize the cost. But this cost is authenticity, presence, and inner strength. The psychological trap is that belonging feels safe, and so we learn to wear masks, to adjust our speech, to hide our deeper thoughts, and to present a version of ourselves that is palatable to others. But there comes a moment when you realize that this false belonging has left you hollow, that fitting in feels empty because you have traded your soul for acceptance. What patterns, defenses, and stories were you forced to adopt just to survive? Jungian individuation demands that you face what your exile truly reveals about the culture itself, because your alienation is not just about you, it is also a mirror reflecting back the dysfunction, the shallowness, and the spiritual emptiness of the world around you. The outsider is not lost in the wilderness, but sees what the villagers ignore, the subtle hypocrisies, the unspoken rules that keep everyone playing small, the exhausting performance of normalcy that requires constant energy to maintain. If you have always felt like you are watching life from behind glass, unable to fully participate in the shallow conversations and performative relationships that seem to satisfy everyone else, then you are already standing at the threshold of something deeper, something more real, something that the world desperately needs, even if it does not yet know how to recognize it. The existential wound, outcasts, and the price of unseen depth. Behind every persona that the outcast presents to the world is a wound, silent and invisible to most, but felt acutely by the person who carries it. This wound is not born of weakness, but of heightened sensitivity to truth, hypocrisy, and the undercurrents of collective anxiety that ripple beneath the surface of social life. While others can participate in small talk without feeling drained, the outcast registers every false note, every performative gesture, every moment of pretense, and this awareness becomes a burden that few people can truly understand. Jung's mirror shows us that individuation begins with feeling alien or rejected, that this is not a sign of failure, but a necessary suffering that cracks open hidden layers of self and culture. The wound is not an enemy, but a signal that individuation is underway, that you are being called toward a deeper level of consciousness that requires you to step away from the comfortable illusions that keep most people asleep. Social camouflage becomes the outcast's default survival strategy, wearing emotional armor and blending in as a way to minimize the pain of rejection and misunderstanding. Yet inside, a chronic conflict unfolds between inner values and external demands, and the more normal the outcast acts, the more profoundly misunderstood they become. Nietzsche warned us that insanity in individuals is rare, but in groups, it is the rule. And this insight reveals a profound truth about the nature of exclusion and solitude. When you are cast out or choose to step away from the herd, you begin to see the collective madness more clearly, the groupthink that masquerades as wisdom, the emotional contagion that passes for connection, the shallow validation that pretends to be love. Exclusion and solitude expose societal madness, but also plant seeds of new perspective, depth, and creative resistance that can eventually become sources of profound strength. The trap of failed belonging is one that many outcasts fall into, where the desperation to escape pain leads them to chase validation, approval, or shallow comfort in ways that betray their deeper nature. This is the moment when the outcast begins to mask what is most unique about themselves, to hide their gifts, to downplay their insights, and to pretend that they are less perceptive than they actually are. This blocks natural growth and individuation because it reinforces the very patterns of self-betrayal that caused the wound in the first place. Instead of asking, "How can I belong?" the question must shift to, "What is the wound here trying to teach me?" This is not about making the pain mean something in a superficial way, but about recognizing that your discomfort and your alienation contain information about both yourself and the world, information that can become the foundation for a more authentic and powerful way of being. Begin journaling moments of acute discomfort and paradoxical insight as tools for individuation, because these moments are where the real work happens. When you feel that familiar ache of being misunderstood, when you notice yourself wanting to explain but knowing that words will not bridge the gap, when you sense the exhaustion of wearing a mask, write it down. Notice what these moments reveal about the environment you are in, about the people around you, about the values that dominate the social space, and most importantly, about the parts of yourself that you have learned to hide or suppress. The outcast is like the canary in the coal mine, feeling what others cannot, paying the price so the collective can awaken before collapse. Your sensitivity is not a curse, but a form of early warning system, and when you learn to read its signals correctly, you transform from victim to sentinel, from wounded to wise. The invisible archetype, how the outcast embodies the trickster's power. According to Jung, the archetype of the trickster inhabits those who cannot follow the herd, yet refuse to collapse into despair. Those who exist on the margins, not because they are weak, but because they serve a different function in the collective psyche. The outcast becomes a catalyst for change, disruption, and hidden wisdom simply by existing outside the social script. And this is a role that carries both power and peril. The trickster is not the fool who is laughed at, but the figure who sees through the game, who understands the rules so well that they can bend or break them, who uses their outsider status as a vantage point from which to observe the patterns that bind everyone else. This is the paradox of marginalization. that what society treats as misfit or outsider often conceals latent creative, strategic, and truth-seeking abilities that threaten the stability of the status quo. The trickster disrupts stale routines and exposes collective blind spots, a dangerous gift that most cultures fear and suppress because it challenges the comfortable illusions that hold social structures together. Shadow integration becomes essential for the outcast who wants to step into the trickster's power, because this archetype demands that you contend with unfamiliar shadow qualities like anger, cunning, defiance, and unorthodox creativity. Jung teaches that harnessing these shadow traits is not about becoming malicious or destructive, but about reclaiming the parts of yourself that you were taught to reject, the parts that do not fit neatly into polite society's expectations. These shadow qualities are sources of vitality, creativity, and strategic intelligence, and when you learn to integrate them consciously, you become far more effective at navigating a world that often operates through manipulation, performative virtue, and hidden agendas. Social pattern blindness is the norm for most people, who never question the norms, rituals, and unspoken rules that govern their behavior and constrain their possibilities. But outcasts see genre rules, groupthink, and emotional contagion for what they are, recognizing the architecture of social control and illusion that most people mistake for reality. This clarity is lonely because you become aware of how much of social life is theater, how much of conversation is scripted, how much of connection is transactional, and this awareness can feel isolating when you realize that most people are not interested in examining these patterns. Yet this clarity is also liberating because it reveals the mechanisms of social power and influence, showing you where the levers are and how they can be moved. Like hermetic figures in myth, outcasts traverse boundaries others cannot, bringing back new perspectives from the margins, from the shadows, from the places where polite society refuses to look. Start tracking patterns that you notice others ignore, the social scripts that everyone follows without question, the shared beliefs that are never examined, the taboo emotions that are always suppressed or denied. Write down 3 heretical truths that you see but rarely voice, observations about human nature or social dynamics that would make others uncomfortable if you spoke them aloud. This exercise deepens archetypal awareness and creative power because it trains you to trust your own perception, even when it contradicts the consensus, and it helps you distinguish between the trickster's wisdom and mere contrarianism or rebellion for its own sake. The outcast is a social trickster, not a clown but a codebreaker, capable of rewriting the map that everyone else blindly trusts. This is not about superiority or arrogance, but about recognizing that your exile has given you a perspective that is genuinely valuable, a way of seeing that can illuminate what others miss and challenge what others take for granted. The rebellion of sensitivity, when vulnerability becomes strategic power. In a culture that rewards emotional numbness and celebrates the image of the untouchable, impervious individual, the outcast's pain and sensitivity are seen as weaknesses, vulnerabilities to be hidden or overcome. But this is one of modernity's most dangerous lies, because sensitivity and depth of feeling are paradoxically the very source of advanced perception and resilience. The danger of hardening yourself in response to rejection and misunderstanding is that this armor eventually suffocates intuition and blocks the adaptive intelligence that comes from being able to read subtle emotional and social cues. Many exiled minds overcompensate by striving to appear untouchable, building walls so high that nothing can hurt them. But in doing so, they also cut themselves off from the very sensitivity that makes them perceptive, creative, and capable of genuine connection. The expectation that detachment means safety is a dangerous social mirage, because true safety comes not from numbness, but from the ability to feel deeply while maintaining inner stability. Sensitivity operates as a sixth sense for the outcast, Much like Dostoevsky's tormented anti-heroes who are hyper-attuned to the weather of a room, the subtext beneath conversations, the moods that shift like invisible currents, the hidden games that people play without even realizing they are playing them. This discomfort is not just suffering, but information, data about the environment that can be used strategically if you learn to interpret it correctly. Psychological studies now show that those who process negative emotion openly rather than suppress it exhibit greater post-traumatic growth, creativity, and social influence in the long run, because they develop a more nuanced understanding of human nature and a greater capacity to navigate complexity. This does not mean wallowing in pain or becoming consumed by it, but rather learning to observe your emotional responses with curiosity and use them as signals that guide you toward deeper self-knowledge and more effective action. Instead of numbing out when you feel overwhelmed or reacting impulsively when you feel hurt, use a daily emotional inventory to name and process subtle inner signals. Set aside 10 minutes each evening to write down what you felt throughout the day, not just the big obvious emotions, but the subtle shifts, the moments of unease or unexpected joy, the physical sensations in your body that accompany different interactions or environments. This practice builds both strategic and emotional self-command because it creates distance between the feeling and your reaction to it, allowing you to choose your response rather than being controlled by your emotions. In chess, masters sacrifice a piece to gain decisive advantage. And what if your so-called unwanted traits, your sensitivity, your intensity, your inability to engage in shallow conversation were actually the pieces you need to sacrifice in the short term to gain a far more valuable long-term position? This is the rebellion of sensitivity, the recognition that vulnerability, when handled with awareness and intention, becomes a source of strategic power that the emotionally numb can never access. Practical application: the Outcast's Toolkit for surviving cultural decay. Strategic integrity means making authenticity your core filter for every decision you make about where to invest your time, energy, and attention. If a role, belief, or social context invalidates your experience or requires you to suppress essential parts of who you are, then that context is not neutral. It is actively hostile to your growth and well-being. Seek edges where your honesty becomes creative leverage. Environments where depth is valued over performance, where questions are encouraged rather than shut down, where people are willing to sit with discomfort rather than rushing to easy answers. This does not mean you will find perfect communities or spaces free from all conflict, but it does mean you can become more discerning about where you place yourself and more intentional about creating pockets of authenticity in a world that often rewards the opposite. Social minimalism is the practice of consciously reducing connections to environments that require constant masking, and instead focusing on building micro moments of real presence with those who genuinely understand you. This is not about isolation or withdrawal, but about recognizing that quality of connection matters far more than quantity, and that one conversation where you can speak truthfully is worth more than 100 interactions where you have to perform. Reality reframing through philosophical reflection becomes essential for the outcast navigating cultural decay. Because without a framework for understanding what you are experiencing, the alienation can feel like personal failure rather than a reasonable response to unreasonable circumstances. Use journaling, stoic meditation, and deep reading to map underlying societal illusions and to inoculate yourself against cultural gaslighting, the constant messages telling you that your perceptions are wrong, that you are too sensitive, that you need to just fit in and stop overthinking everything. Shadow alliances are networks of other outcasts, thinkers, or dissidents who can provide intellectual refuge and validation when the mainstream world feels unbearable. These alliances can form online or in person, through shared interests in philosophy, psychology, art, or any domain where depth and authenticity are valued. A network of honest misfits can accelerate individuation and reduce existential isolation, because it reminds you that you are not alone, that there is a lineage of deep thinkers throughout history who have faced similar struggles, and that your difference is not a defect, but a marker of consciousness. Implement a brief symbolic act each morning, reflecting your unique insight. Something as simple as writing one non-mainstream truth you refuse to compromise on today, or setting an intention to notice one moment where you feel tempted to mask and choosing instead to remain authentic. Viktor Frankl survived the concentration camps partly by clinging to a defiant sense of meaning, a conviction that his suffering could serve a purpose and that he had something important to give the world. What is your defiant purpose, the one conviction that cultural decay cannot take from you? This is not about grand ambitions or external achievements, but about identifying the core value or insight that you refuse to surrender no matter how much pressure the world applies. For some, it might be the commitment to always speak truthfully, even when lies would be easier. For others, it might be the determination to create beauty in a world that celebrates ugliness. For still others, it might be the simple resolve to remain sensitive and open-hearted in a culture that rewards cynicism and detachment. This defiant purpose becomes your anchor when everything else feels uncertain, the fixed point around which your life can organize itself even as the world around you continues to decay. The silent rebellion, strategic detachment in a performative world. There is a particular form of power that the world neither recognizes nor values. A power that operates not through loud declarations or dramatic gestures, but through calculated withdrawal and strategic silence. In a culture that demands constant explanation, justification, and performance, the outcast learns that sometimes the most radical act is to simply stop participating in the exhausting theater of social validation. Strategic detachment is not about becoming cold, cynical, or disconnected from life itself, but about recognizing which battles drain your energy without serving your growth, and which environments extract more from you than they could ever give back. This is the silent rebellion that Schopenhauer understood when he wrote about the importance of solitude and the dangers of losing yourself in the crowd's endless demands for conformity and attention. The outcast who masters strategic detachment discovers that refusing to engage with certain conversations, refusing to defend certain positions, and refusing to perform certain social rituals is not weakness, but wisdom. The performative world operates on a simple assumption that everyone wants to be seen, understood, and validated by the collective, and it uses this assumption as leverage to control behavior and extract compliance. Social media has amplified this dynamic to an almost unbearable degree, creating environments where people feel compelled to constantly explain themselves, justify their choices, share their private lives, and seek approval from strangers who have no genuine investment in their well-being. The outcast who practices strategic detachment recognizes this trap and chooses instead to cultivate a different relationship with visibility and validation. This does not mean complete withdrawal from all social interaction, but rather a conscious decision about when to engage and when to preserve your energy, when to speak, and when silence carries more weight than any words could. The paradox is that the less you explain yourself, the more people lean in to understand you, because mystery and self-containment signal a kind of confidence and inner security that performative oversharing never can. Observation without participation becomes a powerful skill for the outcast navigating modern social dynamics, the ability to be present in a room or a conversation while maintaining enough emotional distance to see patterns, read subtext, and recognize manipulation before it takes hold. This is not about being judgmental or superior, but about protecting your psychological resources and maintaining clarity in environments designed to confuse and overwhelm. Viktor Frankl spoke about the last freedom that no one can take from you, the freedom to choose your attitude and response to any situation. And strategic detachment is the practical application of this principle. When you stop feeling obligated to react, to defend, to explain, or to participate in every social ritual that demands your attention, you reclaim enormous amounts of energy that can be redirected toward genuine creativity, meaningful relationships, and the kind of deep work that actually transforms your life rather than just filling time. The art of being in the world, but not of the world, is perhaps one of the most difficult balances to strike, especially for the outcast who already feels the tension between wanting connection and needing authenticity. Strategic detachment helps you navigate this tension by creating clear boundaries around what you will and will not give to environments that do not deserve your full presence. This might mean showing up to social gatherings, but choosing not to engage in gossip or performative conversations, participating in professional spaces while refusing to play political games that compromise your integrity, or maintaining relationships with family members while declining to enter into old patterns of conflict and emotional manipulation. The key is recognizing that detachment is not rejection or hostility, but a form of self-preservation that honors both your need for connection and your responsibility to protect your inner world from forces that would deplete or corrupt it. Implementing strategic detachment requires daily practice and conscious intention because the default programming in most people is to react, to explain, to defend, and to seek validation whenever they feel misunderstood or criticized. Begin by identifying 3 areas of your life where you consistently feel drained by performative demands or unnecessary explanations. Maybe it is a particular social group that expects you to conform to their values, a family dynamic where you are constantly defending your choices, or an online space where you feel compelled to justify your perspectives to people who have already decided not to understand you. For each of these areas, experiment with strategic withdrawal, not by making dramatic announcements or burning bridges, but by simply giving less, explaining less, and observing what happens when you stop feeding energy into dynamics that never served you. This is the silent rebellion that transforms the outcast from someone reacting to the world's demands into someone who consciously chooses which demands deserve attention and which can be quietly refused. In an age of accelerating noise, strategic silence is not emptiness, but clarity, not absence, but powerful presence that knows its own worth without needing constant external confirmation. Symbolic metaphor and cultural reference, the outcast as avant-garde censor. The outcast's exile is a badge of perception, tangible proof that you are not anesthetized by the status quo, that you have not been successfully numbed into compliance. Like the mythic watchman on the walls or the modern whistleblower, you notice what most are conditioned to ignore, and this noticing comes at a cost, but also confers a responsibility. Cultural echoes of this archetype appear throughout history, from the figure of the fool in Shakespeare, who speaks truths that would cost others their heads, to Dostoevsky's underground men who see through the facades of respectable society, to the prophets and mystics who were often outcasts in their own time before being recognized as visionaries generations later. The outcast is eternally present wherever societies blind themselves, serving as a necessary corrective force that exposes what has been hidden and questions what has been accepted without examination. You are both the mapmaker and the warning signal, charting territory that others fear to explore and sounding alarms about dangers that others prefer to deny. The cracks you perceive reveal more truth than the surface ever will, because surfaces are designed to conceal, to present an image of coherence and stability that may or may not correspond to underlying reality. To be outcast is, in essence, to see clearly while others play blind, and this clarity is both gift and burden. In an age of accelerating decay, where institutions are failing, where trust is eroding, where the gap between official narratives and lived reality grows wider every day, clarity becomes a form of rebellion. What if your exile is not a misfortune, but the first sign of a deeper kind of freedom? Freedom from the need to believe comfortable lies, freedom from the compulsion to fit into systems that are themselves broken, freedom to build something new from the ground up rather than trying to repair structures that are fundamentally unsound. Embracing exile as an evolutionary advantage. Your misfit pain is not something to be medicated, hidden, or overcome through sheer willpower, but something to be mined for radical insight into yourself and your society. The discomfort you feel in mainstream environments is not evidence of your inadequacy, but evidence of your awareness, your refusal to accept illusions as truth, your insistence on depth in a culture that celebrates surfaces. Outcasts do not just survive, they signal, adapt, and often transform the very culture that once dismissed them, becoming the artists, philosophers, innovators, and truth-tellers whose work eventually shifts the collective consciousness even if they never receive recognition in their own time. Individuation, as Jung understood it, is not a privilege granted to the fortunate few, but a struggle that outcasts are forced to master because they have no other choice, because conformity is not available to them, because the pain of fitting in becomes greater than the pain of standing alone. The world's decay becomes your compost when you learn to alchemize suffering into insight, isolation into self-knowledge, rejection into creative fuel. Every alienation is a seed for new roots, perspective, and creative resilience, and the exile that once felt like punishment can be reframed as initiation, the difficult passage that separates those who are content to live on the surface from those who are willing to descend into depth. You do not belong because the old world is dying, because the systems and structures that promised meaning, connection, and purpose are revealing themselves to be hollow, and because you were never meant to thrive in a decaying order. Your truth is the green shoot beneath the dust, the sign of life persisting through collapse, the promise of something new that can only emerge once the old has been cleared away. Now, what will you plant in the soil of your exile? What will you refuse to become even as the world around you demands conformity, compliance, and capitulation? These are not rhetorical questions, but genuine invitations to reflect on how you will move forward from this moment, how you will honor both the pain of your outsider status and the gifts it has given you. This week, notice when you feel that familiar ache of alienation, but instead of turning away from it or trying to fix it, lean into it with curiosity. Ask what this moment is teaching you about the environment you are in and about the parts of yourself that refuse to compromise. Write down one thing you see clearly that others seem to miss. One truth that feels dangerous to speak but important to acknowledge. You are not alone in this exile. You are part of a lineage of deep thinkers, stretching back through centuries, and your willingness to see clearly in a world that prefers comfortable blindness is exactly what makes you valuable, necessary, and ultimately free.